Hi guys and gals, this video is all about the muscle car era. Essentially, a muscle car is a lightweight, mid-sized rocket with a high horsepower engine and plenty of torque and road handling ability. Muscle cars are generally considered a different category from two-seater sports cars. That's the short description, but there's a lot more that goes into an early muscle car, like aerodynamics, braking power, and 4-speed close ratio transmission. The muscle car era generally refers to around 1964 to the early 70s. And in this regard, Pontiac may have led the way. I'll get back to that in a moment, but purists may suggest that the first muscle car was actually a 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 with a 303 cubic inch engine, turning out 135 horsepower on a 2-barrel carburetor. Well, that was quite a lot back then. The 49 Olds set the standard for all other makes to follow. Horsepower grew steadily over the next decade. In 1959, Pontiac installed a tri-power 389 in its full-size Bonneville models. This turned out a high-compression 345 horsepower. Pontiac would keep the 389 until 1966. Now the start of what many believe to be the true muscle car era of our generation. Let's start with GM. At the time, General Motors was strongly opposed to putting big engines in small cars, fearing the loss of market share. But John DeLorean, remember him? Got around that by making the GTO package an option. It started in 1963 when DeLorean and advertising exec Jim Wangers proposed beefing up a mid-sized Le Mans with a powerful 389 325 horsepower engine. A more powerful 3 Deuces 389 engine was available along with a 4-speed transmission. With the stronger package, the GTO would blaze the quarter mile in 14.8 seconds. Along with the engine option came the new GTO badge with the Le Mans name. The GTO was introduced in September 1963 as a 1964 model. GTO stands for Gran Turismo Omologato. The name was inspired by the Ferrari 250 GTO. GM execs had no interest in auto racing, and they were surprised that the GTO package had sold 10,000 units before the beginning of the 64 calendar year, and total sales for 64 were 32,450 cars. And so began the muscle car era, a natural follow-up to the hot rod era of the late 40s and early 50s. It wasn't long until other GM brands would hop on the muscle car bandwagon, as there was competition within General Motors. By the time 65 had rolled around, Chevy beefed up the Chevelle with a 350 horsepower L79 engine for the Super Sport SS model. The Chevelle was one of Chevy's most popular brands, and one of the best-selling mid-sized cars of the era. It remains a muscle car coveted by hot rodders and collectors alike. The Chevelle SS was made from mid-1964 to 1977. In mid-64, the Chevelle was available with a 327 300 horsepower engine. Now let's move on. What about Camaro? The first went on sale in September of 1966 as the 67 model. Chevy needed a counterbalance to Mustang's sales success. From 1967 to 1969, Camaro offered an LS35 SS 396 cubic inch V8 with 325 horsepower. Also, a 396 with 350 horsepower. And the 375 horsepower version. Now here's a quick look at the 62 Chevy with a 409. Remember the song, Getty Up, 409? Oh, it sure did. It was essentially a bored-out 348 with thicker cylinder walls. The 348 came out in 1958 as cars became heavier and required more power. A beefed-up tri-power 348 could turn out 350 horsepower. The 62 Supersport TurboFire 409 churned out a whopping 409 horsepower and came with a 4-speed close ratio transmission. It would do 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds. Oldsmobile was not about to be left behind. Olds brought out their 442 in '64 as an option package for the F-85 and Cutlass. The original 442 badge came from the car's 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed manual transmission, and dual exhausts. Initially, it offered a 330 cubic inch engine with a 4-barrel carburetor. In '65, the engine would be bumped up to 400 cubic inches, turning out 325 horsepower. Optional 3 deuces would add another 10 horsepower. The 442 was made from 1964 to 1987. Back in the early 60s, GM was also turning out luxury muscle cars like the Oldsmobile Starfire and Buick Grand Sport, Riviera, and Wildcat. Over at Ford, they too were getting into the specialty car business. In 1955, Ford came out with its T-Bird model sporting a 292 cubic inch 173 horsepower engine, not what you'd call a muscle car. The next year, they came out with the 312, offering a little more horsepower. When the 390 was first offered for 1961, there was a 375 horsepower high-performance version that featured an aluminum 4-barrel intake manifold, 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, and a solid lifter valve train. In 1964.5, the Mustang made its debut. It was turned out in 1965, featuring a 289 engine. Not exactly a muscle car, but one that caught the imagination of the motoring public. Drag racing had its official start in 1950, and the National Hot Rod Association was formed in 1951 to add regulation to drag racing. By the 1960s, the sport was no longer a passing fancy, but a national obsession. As you might expect, the major car makers were anxious to become involved as racing led to sales. In some regards, Ford led the way in 1963.5, coming out with their drag strip lightweight rocket. It featured a spiked-up 427 engine with dual Holley 4-barrel carbs. It was rated at 425 brake horsepower, but probably it was much higher than that. Only a little more than 200 of these not-for-street-use firecrackers were built for drag use only. Ford, along with other car makers, did everything to lighten weight. In the case of Ford, they used a fiberglass hood, fenders, and wheel wells, and an aluminum bumper. Windows were plexiglass. Seats were lightweight from a Ford minivan. The dashboard was options delete. No radio, no clock. In fact, anything that would add weight was deleted. In 1964, Ford brought out the Fairlane Thunderbolt as a limited-run experimental car specifically engineered for drag racing. The Thunderbolt was based on a 2-door post sedan and featured a relatively lightweight body. It ran a 427 cubic inch engine with dual 4-barrel Holley carbs. The car was not for street use. Perhaps Ford's greatest engine-building accomplishment up to 1963 was turning out the 427 Cammer engine. It turned out 616 horsepower with a single 4-barrel carburetor and 657 horsepower with dual 4-barrel carbs. This made the engine one of the most powerful to come out of Detroit during the octane-fueled 1960s. It was known as the 90-day wonder as Chrysler cried foul. The engine was banned from competition. For GM and Chrysler, big engines and weight reduction was also on their platform as well for drag racing. Back in '63, a special 427 cubic inch version of the 409 engine was used in the Chevrolet Impala Sport Coupe. It was known as the RPO Z11. This was a special package created for drag racers only. Their lightweight drag car used a lot of aluminum and deleting as much weight as possible. The way to win drag races is with light bodies and big engine cars. Now to Chrysler. They came out with their first Hemi engine in 1951, although it wasn't called a Hemi at that time. Rather, it was called Firepower. Hemi is short for hemispherical head. In 1955, Chrysler came out with its first high horsepower engine, a 300-horse Hemi V8. These Hemi engines are still coveted by hot rodders and enthusiasts today. The 413 V8 had been around since 1959, but not until '61 did it find its way out of big Chryslers into smaller Dodges and Plymouths. It made as much as 375 horsepower, but needed more horsepower to compete with other car makers. All 413s had wedge-shaped combustion chambers, but the version unleashed in the spring of '62 was designed for maximum performance. It was called the Max Wedge. In 1964, the 426 Max Wedge Ramcharger 3 was rated at 415 horsepower. Now, the famous 440 engine. It was used to power Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth cars. The 440 was best known for its contribution to the muscle car wars of the late 60s and early 70s. At its peak in 1970, the performance of the six-pack delivered 390 horsepower. But original equipment manufactured blocks could boost power upwards of 550 horsepower. The 440's power declined in 1971 when they brought in emission control standards. Muscle car production was in a tailspin through 1974. Excellent profit margins evaporated. By 1975, muscle cars were pretty well gone. Even the once mighty GTO had bitten the dust. The politically inspired oil embargo of that era sent gas prices through the roof. Between 1973 and 1974, prices more than quadrupled. This may have had an effect on gas-guzzling muscle cars. However, life goes on, and there's a new generation of muscle cars appearing at our car shows and cruise nights. These newer models have more tire-burning power and motivation than we ever thought possible more than 50 years ago. Back in 2017, a Tesla Model S went 0 to 60 in 2.4 seconds. Other electric models are capable of the same lightning speed. It may be sad, but true, the internal combustion engine may be on the verge of becoming a dinosaur. A new age is upon us. I'll miss the sound of those rumbling engines and the smell of gas and grease in the air. But perhaps it won't be long before those of us of a certain age will also be considered dinosaurs. But boy, did we have fun during those golden years when we were young. It was a great time to be alive. And you know something? It's going to come again once this COVID thing has passed. Thank you for viewing. Stay safe. And with a little luck, we'll see you at the car shows and cruise nights later this year. Bye for now.